Hello everyone, I'm Naveen Agarwal and I'm so excited to share with all of you this recording of our recent interactive Q&A session. Now we do this every month where we get together with industry colleagues from the medical device area and discuss in a very casual, informal way key topics related to risk management of medical devices. And it's an open forum, so anybody is welcome to join. Now this month, we discussed two very important topics. The first one is the use of FMEAs to meet the requirements of ISO 14971 in our industry. Many challenges, and we discussed those real-world challenges from industry applications and shared some best practices. The second topic is about treatment delay. Now many things can happen to cause a delay in treatment, and the outcome can be pretty significant in some cases for our patients. So during our risk analysis, we have to identify all those scenarios and also do it in a way that makes the post-market surveillance process easy. And we discuss these challenges. Is it a hazardous situation, or harm? Now these discussions become very relevant in light of a recent Class 1 recall just announced by the FDA. So I invite you to take a look at this recording. But more importantly, please share your thoughts and comments and continue our conversation. If you would like to join us next time, keep an eye on our LinkedIn feed where we will post the announcement for our next session. I invite you again, take a look at this, share your thoughts. Look forward to hearing from you. For those who are new to this forum, let me tell you a few things to welcome you and particularly invite you to engage in a very open forum with us. This is a very casual and informal conversation. This is by no means intended to be, very detailed, going down into the weeds, but really understanding what kind of problems we face day to day as we practice risk management during our practice. And share best practices, ask questions. We won't have clear black and white or yes or no answers to the questions, and that's the whole intent, is to invite participation and engagement and discussion as against a webinar where someone will actually give you a presentation and a lot of content to understand and digest. But we try to kind of keep these discussions very open with a theme. And if you have any pressing questions that you actually brought to this session, I know in the past I have invited you to submit a question. If you already had a question in mind, maybe let's start with that, because that's the whole point. What I have in mind to discuss with you is only important if it is of interest to everybody. But
Naveen,
yeah, go ahead, Bijan.
I can say something. And it relates to our meeting last time. Ed talked about the harmonization of ISO 14971 and its status. Can you talk more about that, where we are with that? Or
so I believe, I hope Ed joins so he can give you more up-to-date information. But my understanding is that it has been approved and released, but not published in the register. So folks in Europe might have more updated information on this. I know many people are on the call right now, so I invite your feedback on that. Anybody has some recent information they can share with us?
Well, Naveen, I have the same info as Ed told last time, because I went through the recording. I missed last time. So it's been decided, but it's not published in the register right now. But we already last 1.5 years for MDR remediations and MDR activities, we considering 19 and then the guide 20. And now we will start considering the new one. That's kind of agreement that whenever we do anything with MDR, we just take the latest one, even if it's not published in the official register right now.
Yeah. And I believe Ed
it's
posted,
with your notified body mostly, because that's what they tell you.
Good point. And I believe that Ed posted an update on LinkedIn in the medical device risk management group. Which is
and I guess he wrote in our knowledge sharing platform as well.
Okay, yes.
Something there.
So you bring up a good point. I think those are also forum where we can continue to engage and exchange this information on an ongoing basis. Just not this forum. We meet once a month, but we can share information there too. Anybody else has any other updates?
One question. Does anybody, Shalu, maybe, did they add annexes ZA, ZB, and ZC?
Yeah.
Or?
Yes, they
Yes.
added. They are
They have done
available
that.
when you buy ENIS, so they are available to us.
Okay.
It's just that it's not published, so it's not
Yeah.
quote unquote official.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right?
but annexes are available.
Annexes are available.
Yep.
But to your point, Shalu, I think the notified body engagement and consultation is very important because they're probably going to expect you to do that anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else has any other recent update on this?
So Naveen, this is Denise Bortone from Philips. I am the USD 04604 person.
Okay.
This
Welcome.
is my first time joining this call. And I unfortunately can't stay the whole time, but I'm just going to listen in if you don't mind and learn.
No problem.
Go along. Okay.
No problem. You're welcome. Welcome. And thank you for joining. Okay. So anybody else had any specific questions in mind you guys wanted to start with? Any particular question? Otherwise, I will set the stage for the kind of case I want to discuss with all of us. I think it could be of interest. Okay. If not,
I have a question.
Yes, please, Jay, go ahead.
So a little bit of a challenge to the group maybe, or not so much, but the question is, can we satisfy or be in compliance with 14971 with just an FMEA without an hazards analysis? Just want to know what the group thought.
Very good question. I think this is of relevance because a lot of us do FMEAs in the industry as a practice. And is it enough? You think, is it sufficient? That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I'm asking the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you guys
Maybe I can input from the latest audits we had last year or the beginning of this year. That's not enough. At least in Europe with MDR, that's straight away rejected, because the problem is with, if we think, like I do risk analysis most of the time, because you always consider a failure mode in FMEA. So you don't really think that a device can pose a risk if there is no failure mode. But there are things which, even if there is no failure, device can still pose a risk. So that's why it's really important now, at least in my experience, we have stopped relying only on FMEA. So it's of course one of the tools, but then you have to have the whole kind of further investigation, especially the intended misuse. When it's non-intended misuse and how you say people should use instruct, but they never do this. So those, you will never think that that can be a failure mode, but it happens still. So that's my input.
Very interesting point. Anybody else? Very interesting point. Thank you, Shalu.
Question for Shalu.
Sorry, Bijan. Those are very different techniques with different purposes. And
Yeah.
I have read a really, really good book, which I can recommend, written by some Mr. Bijanirahi.
Yes, I was about to tell that Bijan can really explain this
so
in
he's
detail. Detail. He's the master of explaining these things.
Awesome. Bijan, you have the floor. You have the floor.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. But before I say more, I wanted to ask Shalu, besides FMEA in your area, in your company, what other tools do you use?
We mostly do, FMEA is first step starting with, and then we have our design and clinical risk metrics made. So where you really take care of the design's risks, which can still arise if there is no failure, and specifically clinical risk metrics, we have created design and clinical risk matrices along with FMEA. So in clinical risk, you consider all foreseeable misuse or if they deviate from the intended use.
Okay.
So for that, it's really a big exercise because you need to involve clinicians. And for my products, like I work for dental industry, so you need to involve dentists or have expert opinions. Because most of the times alone, my team or other design development, everybody, we can't think of the risks which can arise. the
That's
best
right.
way
Yeah.
I found. Yeah, that's what we do. FMEA plus design risk metrics and clinical risk metrics, and then combine them all.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah, so Jay, I agree with Shalu. FMEAs are only a part of the answer. They're not a complete answer. So in fact, if you go by the standard IEC 60812, which describes FMEAs, there is no mention of risk. They have RPN, but RPN is not risk. RPN is criticality. There's no mention of harm. It's only about failure modes and end effects. Some of those end effects are hazard. And as Shalu said, there are cases where a device can present hazards under no failure conditions. So FMEAs are blind to that. In addition to the FMEAs are important, not that you shouldn't do it, you should do it. But in addition to FMEA, what I recommend is a tool that's common, it's called fault tree analysis. What Shalu described as a risk matrix is kind of that. What you do is you're brainstorming about how could possible hazards manifest. You try to imagine using deductive analysis, deductive logic, the root cause of potential hazardous situations. And you combine all of that together with the FMEA to your risk analysis, which in my book I call it RACT, but different companies call it by different names. And that's what you can present as the picture of risk for your medical device.
Excellent.
If you are looking in the technical report 24971, they have explained what an FMEA is to risk management. They have listed a few different creativity techniques and also like explained how you can use an FMEA as an input for risk analysis according to an ISO 14971, if you really want to stick to standards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. It's one thing. It's one input to the risk management.
So Jay, does that help answer a little bit your question?
Yeah, and if I have your permission, I have a follow-up question to that.
Yes.
So the follow-up, and Bijan, by the way, I got the second version of your book recently. Congratulations.
Excellent.
And especially like the examples in the back. So the follow-up question is that can you comply without, or let's say, can you practically conduct risk management activities on your medical device or combination product without an FMEA? Like, has anybody got any experience with that, just not doing FMEA at all?
I have not experienced the absence of FMEAs.
Okay.
So that's pretty telling. It means that FMEA seems to be necessary but not sufficient.
Yes.
And what I would like to share, guys, on this topic, my perspective is, yes, we focus a lot on compliance for right reasons. But to me, a bigger question is our risk management process effective? Can we be effective without using an FMEA? Right? I think that's what in my practice, that's what I focus on. Compliance to me is given, baseline, we must do it. But that's to me is not the driving force of consideration. Can we be effective? And my understanding, probably not, because we need to understand from an engineering point of view, what are the contributing factors that may lead to malfunction of our device? And fix that from a reliability and control point of view. Now, it's a job of the hazard analysis to find how those failure events will link to hazardous situations and harms through a sequence of events. I think that is where we have a huge opportunity in our industry to really get some best practices. How do we do it? It's very hard because you have so many different scenarios. And Bijan's book actually does provide a lot of good practical tips to be able to do that. And we seem to be kind of so immersed in the practice of FMEA. I have seen FMEAs being used incorrectly to equate failure modes with hazardous situations and failure effects with harm almost equivalently. And that is not necessarily correct, because a failure effect is not necessarily linked one-to-one to a hazardous situation or a harm. There are so many other things that happen. And because we are trying to comply, and again, this is my open position, I think we're trying to use it for a compliance purposes. And we find ourselves twisted trying to make an argument using an FMEA as a tool of risk analysis. So A lot needs to be done. We need to think about how we practice risk management and how do we ensure we have compliance. That's where I'm coming from on this. Make sense, guys? Any other thoughts on this? Would love to hear your perspective. I know FMEAs are used very extensively in our industry.
Saurabh's got his hand up, I think.
Go ahead, Saurabh.
Yeah. Hey, Naveen, how are you? Hi, everybody.
Good to have you back, Saurabh.
I know. Sorry, it's been a while.
I know, we missed you. Go ahead, please.
So I think I still get a little confused, even after all these years of doing hazard analysis and FMEAs. What exactly would you all say an FMEA is? Does it something that has just like the failure mode and then RPN evaluation, or does it go to the extent of including severity, harm, and that level of information that you would kind of see, I guess, in a hazard analysis type of approach? Because at least from what I've seen over the last few years here at my company, we use FMEAs. Everything is called an FMEA here. But when I look at it, really, it includes hazard situation, severity, harm, all those elements that are 14971 compliant, but they all call them FMEAs. They don't, it's just terminology here. You can't shift that mindset here to call it something else.
Good. I'm going to invite Bijan to really share his thoughts on it. He's really the expert.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Saurabh, I've seen that too. It's unfortunately a misuse of the term FMEA. When they do that, they have really departed from an FMEA. But sometimes people do is they add extra columns in an FMEA for hazards, hazardous situations, harms, and all that. P1, P2 is like it's kind of like mashing together two different products, which is the risk assessment table and the FMEA. It's not good style. I've seen it many times. An FMEA is literally by the name. It's a failure modes and effects analysis. That's all. Failure modes and effects. There is no harm. There is no hazard. Well, hazard could be the end effects, but there's no harm. There's no risk in an FMEA. I do recommend not mixing them together. FMEA is a risk management. FMEA is an input to risk management.
Yep. Let me add to that, Bijan. I think you're absolutely right. And this is the dilemma we face. We are trying to achieve compliance. We are also trying to achieve effectiveness. And in doing so, we have created one document that is, in my opinion, not really serving its maximum potential. Now, you may include severity in FMEA to facilitate decision making about appropriateness of engineering risk controls. You may, and then it becomes a criticality analysis in addition to FMEA. You may, but hazardous situation is very hard to define in an FMEA because it may occur from a variety of sequence of events, and that's why it should be left alone in a separate document.
Yeah.
So what I have done in my practice, Bijan, very, very quickly to share with the team is I have helped people link their failure modes, causes and effect, and effectively implemented risk controls, or let's say failure risk controls, through a linkage with appropriate hazards, which map to a hazard analysis document, and that leads to a risk assessment document. This is a mapping. And the linkage is provided by a potential hazard that can be foreseen as a consequence of that failure effect being realized.
Yeah.
So that's
one thing I'd like to point out is the word severity. This is a source of, I think, confusion for why people mix up FMEAs with risk management. The word severity is used in FMEA, but it means something different than the word severity in risk management. In an FMEA, the word severity is the property of the end effect and is the significance of the consequences of a failure mode, what happens at the end. It could have nothing to do with safety. It could be that like your device is unreliable, it fails frequently, but it doesn't do any harm to people. Maybe, let's say you have an X-ray machine in a doctor's office, it just doesn't turn on. Well, The patient is there. There's no radiation. You can't turn on the device. So it's unreliable, but not unsafe. The word safety in risk analysis means different things. That is the severity of the harm, the degree of consequences of the harm to a patient. And in ISO TR 24971, they have these 5 words that I'm sure you're all familiar with: catastrophic, critical, major, minor, negligible, or serious, minor, negligible. Those are words that define severity of harm. And that's meaningful in the world of risk management. In the world of FMEA, severity means different things, but it's the same word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely great point. And where I was going with that discussion was, you could potentially, extend the line from failure effects through hazard mapping and identify potential applicable harms if that failure effect were to be realized. So what I have really advised or help people do is, you do that analysis through different documents, through different subject matter expert opinions, but identify, let's say, 4 or 5 potential applicable harms that could be relevant. And it is the severity of those harms that may be a relevant factor in your decision making about the appropriateness and effectiveness of the engineering risk controls you have implemented. It's a decision making tool in my mind.
Yeah. One other thing that I think I can add, maybe Saurabh would be interesting to you, is that there is a benefit from FMEA to risk management, and there is a linkage, as Naveen was just talking about, for those failure modes whose end effects create a safety risk. The causal chain to that failure mode becomes a sequence of events in the risk management. So you can copy paste, basically. You can really take benefits from your FMEAs directly into your risk management table. But it has to be a safety related failure mode, not a non-safety related failure mode.
That's pretty good.
And that's the thing what happens when you're mixing the terms and putting an FMEA and risk analysis together, you get something where you can't distinguish between safety and quality or reliability. That means that you are putting all requirements that are connected to risk management in the medical device world on your document, which is not only connected to safety, but also to quality. So you have a really, really overloaded document, and basically you are putting much more requirements onto you and onto your file than are needed. So like basically for implementation and effectiveness of risk controls. In my opinion, you don't really need that, or it is not required by 60812 to have effective implementation effectiveness for how are they called, mitigations for an FMEA. You are not even required to, like the MDR says, to lower the risk as far as possible. So when you're putting all of this together in one document, you are having like a lot of additional requirements which you have to follow, which is a really, really big disadvantage.
That is a great point. And I really wish this message is also clearly communicated to the notified body auditors. Because I'm hearing right now from several of my clients that they are being asked to show all kind of documentation at the FMEA level to comply with this requirement. So I think this is great discussion, and I hope a lot of people learn from it and consider this, because we need to work as a team. Auditors should be working as a team with us and not kind of giving us findings that will actually take us to a different path. And I don't think they mean to do that. Their interpretations might be very different. So I'm hoping this discussion really becomes quite common and popular in our industry, and all of us can build a good understanding. Great conversation, guys. Any other thoughts and comments on this topic? I know it's a big topic, but great question, Jay and Saurabh, for bringing this up. So if no more thoughts, you guys want to discuss our delayed treatment topic? Or does anyone else have any other questions in mind that they want to discuss in this forum today? Okay, if not, I'm gonna this time share my screen with you guys. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
So I was very intrigued by it personally, because again, I have seen this as a topic of conversation in many different applications. And I thought it'll be good to pose this question to the team. So this is from a recent recall alert that, I get messages every week from the FDA. X company is recalling its X product due to the potential inaccuracies caused by the biopsy depth gauge cycle view. So here's what caught my eye. If the user encounters a software issue where the graphical biopsy depth gauge is no longer synchronized with other navigation views, it may result in a prolonged procedure, the need for an additional surgical procedure, aborted procedure, tissue injury, including potential for life-threatening injury such as hemorrhage, unintended tissue damage, or permanent neurological injury, which could lead to death. So they have basically thrown the kitchen sink at this from a risk analysis point of view as the potential harms associated with this issue that may lead to a delay in treatment or prolonged treatment or aborted treatment. So this caught my eye, and I posted on LinkedIn, immediately after I saw this, a lot of interest, over 2,500 views, 24 comments, and I picked a couple of comments here to share with you as a background. Delay of procedure treatment is always a tricky question, but certainly the type of procedure treatment, urgency of procedure treatment, for example, defibrillation or emergency chest tube placement, patient's underlying clinical status, and potential clinical sequel from the delay all play into the decision. Yes, very valid point. Second, it is really an interesting topic as it applies to almost each medical device. I prefer to handle through sequence of events with consideration to the state of patient's health. Finally, some guidance here, and this is the advantage of our engagement. We learn so much from each other. Here's great guidance. FDA CDRH addressed the topic in one of their benefit risk guidance documents. There are 4. Delay of treatment is a topic also addressed in ISO TR 24971, 2020 Annex H for IVDs. While it is focused on IVD, Annex H has some valuable discussions that can be applied to other devices as well. So I want to leave it at this and open the floor for just discussion. Have you come across this issue in your risk analysis? How do you handle it? What are your challenges, and what best practices have you applied as you address this topic? This is very common. So floor is open, guys. Anybody who wants to chime in, you're welcome.
Could you put that slide back up again?
Yeah. Do you want me to? Okay, let me go ahead and do that. Here, share. I'll leave my screen on in case you want to see that. So share. Saurabh, is this the slide you were wanting to see? Or the recall?
The one before.
Okay. Yeah.
My approach was basically really easy because I love to stick to standards, and I found an example in ISO 4971 where a similar example is managed. That delay of procedure, or how is it named there? Where is it? Lack of proper procedure therapy is considered a hazardous situation. Mm-hmm. Because I don't like to handle it as a sequence of events, because you then end up pretty quick in not the first or direct harm, but like following harm. So basically you're having one harm that happens, and then you have a harm based on another harm, and then you basically end up in every case you're looking at in death of patient.
Yep. Eventually it leads to the death of patient.
Like that in sequence of events. I like to look at the first harm that happens.
Okay.
Otherwise you have this butterfly effect.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Alex. Anybody else?
Naveen, I have some experience with trying to navigate using delay in treatment. Yep. In 2 experiences I've had, delay in treatment was the harm. So in a risk analysis, it was, there was a sequence of events, there was a hazardous situation, and then delay in treatment was the harm. But, if you think about it in the IMDRF code lists, delay in treatment is actually considered part of Annex F, which is health impact. And so if you're really going to, kind of use those codes, you would need to choose a code from Annex E, which is your clinical signs and symptoms. So it kind of begs the question of, you could say delay in treatment is a harm, but really the question is, what is the clinical sign or symptom? And there could be countless specific clinical signs or symptoms that come from delay in treatment. So, I think that the tricky thing is, if you're going to try to decide what the severity should be, it almost seems that you need to be able to isolate a specific clinical sign or symptom, or potential clinical sign or symptom. So that's where the challenge comes in for me is, I could say as a clinician, prolonging a procedure, having a patient be under anesthesia for more time than initially anticipated. I mean, certainly having to abort a procedure, there's all kinds of problems with that in real clinical practice, but how do you put your finger on the specific harms that might come from that? Because there could be countless number of harms.
Absolutely. And I think this is the challenge I heard Alexei kind of share with us, because it can go in many different directions, eventually leading to the patient death. So this is definitely a real challenge. And I think that's exactly why we have in this FDA announcement all these potential outcomes. So challenge for us practitioners would be, how do we treat this, right? Alexei, you mentioned that ISO 14971 provides guidance, and they say treat this as a hazardous situation. Now, by definition, hazardous situation is a circumstance where the user or patient is exposed to one or more hazards. Then we should identify, if this happens, what are the hazards that user is exposed to, and then build a sequence of events to see what potential harms could happen, to Erin's point, and find out what the clinical outcome could be. That's like my thought process about this, because eventually you cannot avoid outlining the potential outcomes and using clinical judgment about what you should capture as a potential known or potential outcome or harm of this issue. So hazardous situation, if you want to treat it that way, I think it's okay. It's a good first step forward, but I don't see how you could avoid walking the sequence of event line in your analysis. So I'm personally struggling with that. Thoughts, questions?
For delay in procedure, or I've used it as a harm category.
Yep.
Typically, and depending on what I guess your business is or the product is, you can quantify that, I think, based on
Saurabh, if you have used that as a harm, could you share with us your thought process about identifying a potential severity of harm for that? You don't have to share with us the exact rating you use. Please don't do that.
Right.
But share with us your thought process in the light of what we heard from Erin, that you could have many different outcomes.
Yes.
How do you decide that?
What I've done in the past for this is we've created levels for it, right? So basically matching all the different severity levels for the types of delays, right? Because there might be some parts where during the procedure where there's a minor delay, and that could be, at a severity 0 or 1 or whatever your rating scale starts at. So we've mapped it out, and we've put in details to explain when you would use that, like different situations or scenarios on which that type of rating would be applicable. And then as it goes down the scale to higher severity, we typically pair that with the other, I guess, clinical harm that could occur. Like, for example, if there's vascular damage or nerve damage based on a procedural step. Like, I've worked in spinal industry, and as you go through some of the procedure, if you nick an artery or a vein or something, that's going to take additional time because you're going to prolong the procedure, additional exposure to anesthesia, while you might need there's also the additional time needed for a vascular surgeon to come in and help repair or make repairs, and then to continue with the procedure and or abort if that's if it's too risky at that point. So on its own, it's not a harm really, but we pair that with it to explain that, okay, you have nerve damage for maybe for a different hazardous situation that occurs. Like if they're using some sharp object and they go the wrong way and they nick an artery. So you'll have the damage, but then you'll also have the severity of the prolonged exposure, prolonged delay that occurs with it. So as you get higher in severity, it usually pairs with something. So we might have one hazardous situation with many harms.
Let me clarify one thing with you, Saurabh, so I understand this. You mentioned that you treat this as a harm. So then would I expect to see delay in treatment appearing several times in your risk assessment with a different severity assignment based on the specific scenario you are mapping into? Is that?
Oh, yeah, that's what I've done, yeah.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Great, thank you for sharing that, Saurabh. Anybody else?
No, I will agree with Saurabh. We almost did the same approach for delayed treatment, like he said. It appears several times, but then you relate it to patient safety and clinical risk. So that's how, means every delayed treatment may not be really very risky. So I agree with Saurabh. It's good approach. We also did it for some of our devices.
One additional clarification on that. We had a severity and harms document where it was kind of our guiding document for all the harms we've listed. And we made a clear explanation that the delay in treatment, what exactly it meant from a clinical standpoint, that it's not, in itself, it's not really a harm, right? But it's a way to quantify or to help explain the magnitude of the harm. So we made sure that we explained that it's a prolonged anesthesia and the effects that come along with that.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts and comments on this? So in that case, Saurabh, I do have a follow-up question for you. How do we then address the point raised by Aaron, where if you took that approach, you would have to look for a certain code for the reportability purposes, not as a clinical sign and symptom, and you won't find it if you treat this as a harm. It will be an effect. Aaron, I'm paraphrasing what you said, but if I say something incorrectly, please tell me. So how do you reconcile that? Saurabh, do you have any suggestions, any best practices for that?
So explain that again, sorry.
So let's say you receive a complaint where your analysis indicates there was delay in treatment. So from your risk documents, you will identify that as a harm. And it has a potential for serious harm based on your mapping. Then you have to report it to the FDA or other regulatory authorities from IMDRF codes or FDA codes. By the way, for those who are attending for the first time, we did a full session on standardized codes on this. The recording available, you can watch. You would have to pick an appropriate code for delay in treatment. And if you treat that as a harm, you won't find that in the annexes that you use to select the right code. So really, in the eyes of IMDRF or FDA or other regulatory bodies, they don't treat this as a clinical sign or symptom or a harm, but an effect of something.
So there's no codes for delays in procedure?
Not as a harm. Aaron, is that correct?
No, that's my recollection is that the IMDRF, again, they have two annexes. Annex E is clinical signs, symptoms, or conditions. So something like bleeding or infection. And then the Annex F is the overall health impact, one of which is delay, I believe, delay in procedure or delay in treatment, prolonged hospitalization, unnecessary surgical procedure. These are all health impacts. So I think, and I don't know what the requirement is. Must you choose both one from E and F? I believe you are supposed to, at least on the European MIR mirror form. But if you have a delay in treatment, but you don't have any specific harm that went with it, right? The customer calls and complains and says, you know, in the middle of the operating procedure, the device malfunctioned, and, you know, it ended up taking us 2 hours longer because we didn't have this special device to help us get through the procedure. Now, there was no specific harm mentioned, but the patient was subjected to the conditions of surgery for 2 extra hours. So I guess that my question is, in that case, if we consider that a harm has occurred, you know, I don't know that it's sufficient to say delay in treatment. I think the goal would be to choose another condition, or perhaps I don't know. Perhaps you can designate for Annex E that there were no clinical signs, symptoms, or conditions, but you still indicate the delay.
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, I haven't done this in practice using the IMDRF codes, but theoretically, what I would suggest is, depending on when the delay occurred, if you can pinpoint it through the investigation, to determine that, like, if you've structured your risk file by the each of the use steps or the workflow of the actual procedure, you can kind of determine what the potential harms are. Now, I'm not sure if, do you report potential harms as well? I think you do, right? So if there's a 2-hour delay, there are some potential other harms that you pair that with, that in the approach that I was describing typically. So you could say that these could be foreseeable harms that may occur. And that might be the only way to do it that way.
But in Annex F, there is actually a code for delay to treatment therapy.
Oh,
Right, in Annex F, but I've seen, when you think about harms, specific concrete harms to a patient, in my experience, those have typically come from Annex E, which maps to the FDA code list. So, you know, in a couple of experiences I've had, companies are trying to align their harms on their risk analysis chart with codes that have been identified by the FDA and IMDRF, so that you have that nice clean feedback from your post-market surveillance process, the harms you're choosing on your reporting forms for FDA in Europe and other places, and then you have that exact same terminology in your risk documentation. And that's where I think the issue has come up for me, because we may have wanted to you know, have delay in treatment in our risk files, but it's not as clean when you want to report something as a serious injury and say it was delay in treatment, because there isn't a perfect code for that. That's my experience. So that's where the challenges come in.
Or Aaron, if I add to that, if you did that, there's a chance that it may be considered to relate to the maximum potential severity, even though it didn't occur. So let's say you treated that as a harm and you don't have any other information, and you reported that. I'm wondering if that's where FDA would come and say, you know, now we're gonna start taking all these guesses, which is what they have done in this alert, and maybe consider the most severe outcome.
How many companies actually would do that and put that forward? Like, what?
In terms of reporting?
Yeah.
I think, Aaron, you might want to share some experience with you. That's, in my understanding, is that you have to report all reportable events with an appropriate code. So if delay in treatment is common,
severity.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I'm following the question. You know, if you've determined that in the event in question, there was, you know, an effect on the patient that qualified as a serious injury, you'd have to report that. So is a delay in treatment considered a serious injury? If you believe, based on the facts of that event, that it was, then it needs to be reported as such.
I think what I mean is, if you if that's the question and you don't know what other harms to put there for that, and you were to list all the other potentials, I guess, how far would you go, or how many potentials would you list if you've identified many, but they don't all necessarily, I mean, there's so many circumstances that have to occur for those to actually occur or happen. So from a reportability standpoint, like how far should you go?
And that's exactly the challenge I think I'm presenting, is that, yes, what do you say happened as far as a concrete clinical harm when you don't have anything specifically mentioned. So it just comes back to a question that I see frequently when there's a delay. So a complaint comes in and says our procedure was delayed, or even the start of some type of procedure, maybe an emergency treatment was delayed. How do you approach that in terms of your risk file and reportability? So I think there's probably lots of experiences and ways to do it, but that's essentially the question Naveen had posed on LinkedIn. Saw that.
So this is a perfect scenario where we need to think about, again, effectiveness of our process, right? At the end of the day, we need to evaluate post-market information and take appropriate action. The other extreme I have seen, Saurabh, first of all, thank you for sharing this and highlighting that you actually go forward in different scenarios and assign an appropriate severity of harm. The opposite scenario I have seen in real world, delay in treatment is considered to be like a placeholder item in FMEAs with an assigned severity of 1 or 2, because they are thinking at most, the procedure will be delayed. Now you have a pretty big problem on your hand, in my opinion, because you have really kind of not considered all potential sequence of events or outcomes and made an assumption about the severity of that delay in treatment, considering that as a harm. So the challenge, I think there are more challenges in my mind if you treat that as a harm. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. The ISO 14971 guidance, as Alexei had pointed out, consider this as a hazardous situation. Maybe that's useful. You could also consider this as a hazard, because hazard in theory is a potential source of harm. Delay happened, as a result, some other harms happened. So many different ways, but when it comes to treating this as a harm, you are really thinking, you have to think a little bit more in terms of other implications in my mind. And certainly it could be working for you, Saurabh. I'm not saying it's not working for you, but to me, it would present some challenges.
I think the other thing you said assign 1 or 2. It all depends on what you're setting it for and like what your products are. Like in the experience, the example I gave, it was from a spinal company, and having an open procedure and a delay of 60 minutes to over an hour is that's life or death on somebody, right? So that's why we had the different tiers, like up to 30 minutes. All the surgeons we've talked to said that it's fine, they'll be fine, so it is a 1 or 2 type of severity, but so
okay, but in that scenario, you specifically provided details why you have chosen a lower severity.
Oh yes, everything, it's for a reason. Like in the business I'm in now, some of the delays we have are S1s, like very low severity, but they're listed in there.
And in the other scenarios, you did identify a higher severity. So the approach you took was essentially you did look into sequence of events and different hazardous situations coming from delayed treatment as an initiating event, sort of.
Yeah, the backing of all the ratings we've put had circumstances in which would get you to that rating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, it is sort of a, definitely the right up. You might be calling it by some other term, but the approach is right, is that you are looking forward, you're looking ahead, building the sequence of events and identifying specific hazardous situations for specific harms.
I think the advantage of doing that is to prevent inconsistencies. And that was the biggest reason we did that, because someone may rate a 5-minute delay as an S1 and someone may put it as an S2. So we had to define it. So that's, from a delay perspective, it's good to determine that from your organization.
So how do you then
Can I ask
go
a
ahead,
question?
Bejan. Yes, Bejan.
So, Saurabh, how do you how and where do you quantify the duration of the delay?
In the harm description itself. So it's prolonged delay of procedure or surgical procedure up to 5 minutes, up to 30 minutes, up to 60. So we had ranges in the harms. So we created specific harms in our listings. So we have our giant harms list where we have, allergic response or all the different harms we had listed, and delay was a set of harms that we had.
Okay, so the duration is captured in the severity column? So
in the harm description, the harm naming.
So you have in your harms list, you have, let's say, 5 rows, delay less than 5 minutes, delay between 5 minutes and 15 minutes, and so on.
Correct,
okay.
Yeah.
And then for each of those, do you have one severity ranking or more than one severity ranking?
One severity ranking.
Okay. And the hazardous situation then for those harms would be shown as, again, for each of those multiple rows in your risk table?
Yes, yeah. It could be varying hazard situations. But in our harms list, what we did was we just put in the harm description, the severity, and then descriptions / like circumstances that would get you there.
Mm-hmm.
So it would explain like, okay, different procedural steps that may result in these types of delays.
Yeah. Interestingly, but I don't know if Naveen you found it, but F05 in Annex F is defined as delay to diagnosis, and F06 is delay to procedure, to medical procedure.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry,
in Annex F of the codes?
Yeah. In Annex F, F04 is delay to diagnosis, and F05 is delay to treatment.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
It's still, to Aaron's point, though, it is still not in the Annex E, which is the clinical sign and symptom.
Right. I actually don't agree with it personally. I think the term is not correct. They should maybe term it differently if they want to keep it in Annex F. Delay itself is not a harm, in my opinion, but delay could be a source of harm.
Mm-hmm.
So in my teaching, I advise people to call it combined outcomes of delay. And that is this because, as I think Aaron was mentioning, a lot of things can happen when you delay a therapy. All kinds of, you're exposed to all kinds of hazards, anesthesia, bacteria, gases, all kinds of stuff that happens to the patient. So there are many harms that can happen as a result of delay. So my advice has been to combine with consultation to medical safety, create a category called combined harms of delay. And that would correspond to F05. Instead of just calling it delay, I call it combined harms as a result of delay to therapy.
Perfect.
This is also something that I do. So, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, Bijan.
No, go ahead, continue.
Go ahead.
Yeah, this is something that I do as well. I have like 1 or 2 placeholders for like those general harms that could happen out of an indirect harm from the medical device itself. Because I often have medical devices which are not so often causing direct harm, but are supporting this surgery and are causing like indirect harm through having failures where they can't provide the performance. And this is where it gets like really, really tricky to identify a concrete harm, because a lot of stuff can happen, for example, when the light goes out.
Yep. But I want to emphasize again, I think, Bijan, you really provided a very, very nice suggestion, combined harm as a result of delayed treatment, right? Mm-hmm. That's what you're saying, is that treat that as a category.
Yeah, because so there are so many things that can happen, and in the interest of efficiency, and as you call it, like effectiveness, instead of exploding your harms list into many, many rows, and we just talk about combined harms. And so what I would do is I would consult the medical safety people, like let's say a surgeon, and you say, if I delay your surgery by 5 minutes, what are the consequences of that? Usually the answer is nothing. And then what about if I delayed it by half an hour? What about that? And then it depends on the surgery. Are you doing brain surgery or are you doing toenail surgery? You know, it really varies from part of the body, type of surgery, type of device. All of those have an effect. So you make combined harms as a result of delay to therapy for this particular product. This is not a universal answer. So for this particular product, like my last product was a deep brain stimulator. So we were opening people's brains, and delay was not good. So that was more severe, and we have to be very careful about that versus if you're doing a topical skin surgery, you know.
So I have a quick question for you, Jean. So are you saying that you would use this phrase, combine harms as a result of delay, and that would go in your harms column in your risk analysis, and you'd have your hazardous situation, which is the delay?
Yes.
Patient exposed to a delay in procedure, delay in treatment, and then your harm would be combined harms, and then you could choose the appropriate severities.
Exactly. Yeah. So your sequence of events would be like something happens and the device fails, more events happen, and then you create a hazard, which is the delay. The patient is exposed to delay of surgery, for example. Now, what happens as a result of that? The combined harms of delay, which is a kind of catch-all category in your harms list.
Great discussion, guys, as always. And I know we are almost hitting our hour. Time flies, and this is fascinating discussion. Certainly not the only one we're going to have. So something to keep in mind that we talk about these big topics, and the goal is to promote understanding, share best practices. And we can pick this up again. If you go back to your work, think about some specific scenarios, and you would like to discuss that, bring those questions back. We'll continue to discuss. We talked about cybersecurity one time. We talked about standardization of codes. And our goal is to continue promoting a higher level of understanding. So unfortunately, we are about to run out of time. So I just want to open the floor very, very quickly if anybody has any final thoughts or comments or questions or suggestions for us. No?
You're doing great.
Okay, great. So if that is the case, I will close by actually sharing with you. Some of you are already members of this, but those of you who are new, I want to share with you our knowledge sharing forum. Absolutely free to join. We now have over 90 people on this, and intent here really is to continue our conversation beyond this interactive Q&A. As a follow-up to our discussion today, you will get an email asking for your feedback. Please give us your honest feedback and suggestions for improvement. And you'll also get another follow-up email to invite you to join this forum. And I really look forward to you thinking about joining this forum and sharing your expertise.